Hello and welcome to another edition of Viewpoint. The proposed emissions trading scheme has emerged as one of the most politically contentious issues on the government's agenda. Over the past 12 months, a Senate committee has been inquiring into the fuel and energy industry, including the impact of a trading scheme on that sector. The committee recently released its interim report, and I spoke to its chairman, Senator Cormann, about the inquiry's findings. Senator Cormann, it's a pleasure to have you back on the program. The last time we spoke, of course, was about alcopops, but this time a completely different subject, emissions trading. You chair an inquiry into fuel and energy, and you've just released an interim report on the government's proposed emissions trading scheme. Were you always planning to release an interim report, or was that a decision that you took because it was politically opportune?
Look, we've got a very comprehensive set of terms of reference as the Fuel and Energy Committee. We were set up nearly a year ago, towards the end of June last year, and one of the things that we were asked by the Senate to look at then was the government's proposed emissions trading scheme. And of course, given that that was the time the government had just released the Green Paper and was going through a consultation process there, we thought that we would prioritise the government's proposed carbon pollution reduction scheme in the first instance. And of course, that was very timely, because since then we've had the White Paper and there have been various other developments since then, and we've now been able to present this final report in relation to our assessment of the emissions trading scheme.
When you say our assessment, of course, there are in fact two reports, a majority report of the coalition senators, because you have a majority on the committee and you're the chair as a Liberal senator, and a dissenting report, a minority report of government members. Do you think that there is that division? I mean, it's predictable, obviously, that there will be a division like that, but do you think that that undermines the value of this report?
Well, ours has been a very thorough inquiry, and I think you'll find, if you go through the evidence that we've received and the questions that were asked, it was a very bipartisan spirit on the committee for what was actually, potentially a pretty divisive political issue. I think that as we have gone through the inquiry, we're motivated by putting proper scrutiny in terms of what was put on the table by the government in July last year. Now, the reality is that our committee, contrary to the standing committees of the Senate, has a majority of coalition senators on it. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear me say that coalition senators, opposition senators, are more enthusiastic when it comes to applying rigorous and robust scrutiny on government initiatives than what government senators might be. So from that point of view, I'm not surprised that there has been a small minority report, and I'm not surprised of the gist that was of the statements that were made by government senators. Having said that, our report is very comprehensive. It is a serious attempt at assessing the costs and the benefits of the carbon pollution reduction scheme as proposed by the government. More than 200 pages. More than 200 pages in the report, 18 recommendations. I think we should move forward from here.
Well, let's move through those recommendations. What are the primary ones from your perspective?
Well, I mean, it's essentially, after an inquiry that went for nearly a year, we've come to the conclusion that the Australian economy would suffer without the benefit to the global environment if the CPRS would proceed in its current form. So I guess the main recommendation is that we are advising the Senate that the CPRS in its current form should not be supported. We've also called on the government that they should go back to the drawing board and reconsider the approach that they're taking in terms of the emissions trading scheme that they've put forward. Because we don't believe that in its current form it is either an effective way of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. We think it will put significant additional pressure on our economy. We think it will reduce our international trade competitiveness. It will cost jobs. It will put our energy security at risk, and it will be particularly disastrous for regional economies across Australia.
Well, I want to come back and talk to you specifically about some of those elements, but the fact that the Prime Minister has recently announced a 12-month delay to the introduction of an emissions trading scheme obviously doesn't deal with any of the concerns of the opposition, or indeed satisfy the findings of this report.
The government has been all over the place on this. I mean, we've had very robust rhetoric from the government for a year now. Essentially, anybody who dared question or scrutinise the proposal that put forward was accused of being a climate change denier, a non-believer, and of course it was never about this. It was about a very simple question. Is the scheme that the government has put forward going to be effective in reducing global greenhouse gas emissions? Is it going to do it in an economically responsible fashion? And is it mindful of the energy security needs of Australia moving forward? Now, our assessment is that on the balance, it doesn't achieve, it's not effective environmentally, and it will put significant pressure on the economy and jobs, which is why we think the government should go back to the drawing board.
In terms of this report, apart from suggesting that the government really should go back to the drawing board, you are making recommendations as to what should happen?
Well, we are, and I think and the first point here is that we think that the government is pursuing the wrong target. The government is very focused on domestic emissions reduction targets and essentially has not set any targets whatsoever by its own admissions in terms of global greenhouse gas emission reductions. And because of that, as a consequence of that, there's a whole range of design flaws in the scheme that are a direct consequence of not focusing on what should be the actual objective, which is reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. So if there is to be a scheme, it ought to be a scheme, for example, that does not penalise industries that might produce emissions in Australia but can help contribute to reductions in emissions around the world. For example, the LNG industry. It'll be much harder under the government's carbon pollution reduction scheme for the LNG industry to grow, even though, and that is because there will be increased emissions domestically, even though if the LNG industry were to grow, not only would it be good for our economy, but it would actually help reduce emissions around the world. And so...
Well, I think I understand the issue you're raising, but just explain that for me in a bit more detail.
Essentially, it's this. The government is working on the assumption that that reducing emissions domestically in Australia is the key game. Well, it's not the key game, because at times increasing emissions in Australia could well be a better way of reducing emissions for the world. And the LNG is a particular example of that. For every tonne of emissions in Australia, we can reduce, if it's exported to China, we can reduce global emissions by 5.5 to 9.5 tonnes. If that LNG is exported to Japan, for every tonne of emissions in Australia, additional emissions in Australia, we can reduce emissions in Japan by about 4.5 tonnes. So there is a net beneficial effect for the world, yet...
And that's because it's an alternative energy source?
Well, it's because it would replace coal, for example, in China, and essentially the government scheme, quite counterintuitively, will actually result in increased emissions potentially, rather than a reduction in emissions. I mean, the example I've just given you is just but one. The next one is if we export jobs and industries that are much more environmentally efficient in Australia into competing countries where there's no price on carbon, it is quite conceivable that there will be more pollution around the world, less emissions in Australia, less economic activity and less economic growth, but no environmental benefit for the world, when that should be our overarching objective. I guess that is one of the key points that we've been seeking to make as a committee.
Now, even though it's decided to defer the introduction of the scheme, the government still wants to pass the legislation so that it can go to the forthcoming Copenhagen conference and display its commitment to acting on this issue. You don't see any great significance in that?
Well, the government says we need to lead by example. We, Australia, representing 1.4% of emissions globally, we need to lead by example so that the rest of the world will fall into line and do the same as we have done when they meet in Copenhagen. The committee has considered that argument, and we don't believe it's a legitimate argument. Essentially, conversely, we actually believe that if Australia goes down this very aggressive scheme, the most aggressive, complex and bureaucratic scheme anywhere around the world, and the rest of the world, of the impact it has on our economy, on jobs, without delivering an environmental benefit, it could well be counterproductive in terms of the attitude of other countries that might be considering taking similar action in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
That's certainly the view that Dr. Brian Fisher, the former head of the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics, takes. He's quite critical of the Treasury modelling of the emissions trading scheme. You chose, Dr. Fisher, to peer review the Treasury modelling. And is Treasury's analysis really that deficient?
Well, I think Dr. Brian Fisher put his finger on a whole range of flaws in the Treasury modelling, and we've received evidence from across the spectrum of witnesses, from Paul Howes, the National Secretary of the Australian Workers' Union, to Brian Fisher, to even people in the environmental movement. There was a general consensus that the Treasury modelling was inadequate. The committee takes the view that the modelling was part of a political exercise on behalf of the government. The government directed the Treasury as to how the modelling was to be conducted. There are some very obvious flaws. One of them is that Treasury assumed that the rest of the world would take action to the same extent as Australia, which is a very unrealistic assumption. They did not take into account the impact of the current global economic downturn. The Treasury modelling never assessed the impact of the carbon pollution reduction scheme on jobs. That is something I don't believe that is widely understood. The Treasury modelling had a working assumption of full employment throughout the implementation of the scheme. So rather than to assess the impact as a modelling result, the Treasury modelling had an assumption that there would be full employment, which of course is a very serious flaw in terms of the way the results are interpreted as part of the policy and political debate. There's a whole range of other flaws. I mean, for example, there's an assumption that there is a seamless transition in terms of energy suppliers and energy infrastructure from today being part of being in a carbon based economy to a sort of a low carbon economy. When we're talking about infrastructure that is millions and billions of dollars worth of infrastructure where there's serious investment issues involved, and the government wants us to believe that there's going to be a seamless transmission, that as soon as the scheme comes in place, somebody else is going to come over and it's just all going to work out when we don't believe that that is very realistic.
Let's go back to the issue of jobs. What do you see as the effect on employment?
Well, I mean, firstly, whether it's the steel industry, whether it's aluminium, whether it's cement, whether it is LNG. I mean, these are all industries. Australia is an exporting nation. Our economy is by exports. We are a comparatively small country in terms of our population base. Exports are a significant part of our economy, more so than Europe. I mean, the European emissions trading scheme is often sort of put forward as an example. Well, they can do it, why can't we? Well, Europe has got a very sizable internal market, whereas Australia's internal market is much smaller, so we're dependent on exports. Now, if we are imposing a cost on our export industries that is not faced by our competitors overseas, then we will make them less competitive. Investment will go into those locations where there is a better return on investment. Businesses will close. We've had BlueScope in Wollongong. They didn't beat around the bush, essentially telling us that there were 20,000 jobs at risk in the Wollongong region. There were businesses, the cement industry, the coal industry, all industries who are telling us that they're already under pressure in the current economic and that if the carbon pollution reduction scheme was introduced in its current form, it would mean additional job losses.
Fairly obviously there would be a greater impact on jobs in energy intensive industries because as costs rise they become less competitive. You mentioned earlier liquid natural gas. That's obviously something that's of significance and importance to you as a West Australian senator, and one of the findings of the report is that the biggest impact economically would be on Western Australia and Queensland.
Well, I mean, that's certainly the case. And I mean, again, going back to the Treasury modelling for a moment, Treasury did not assess the impact of the carbon pollution reduction scheme on regional economies. The New South Wales state government commissioned Frontier Economics to do a review of the impact on regional economies, and their assessment was that essentially there'll be a 25 to 30% reduction in regional economic activity of the carbon pollution reduction scheme. So regional areas are going to be hardest hit. That report has never been published. One of the media outlets was able to get its hand on it through a FOI request, but it's not something that has been put out there for people to digest and to sort of see whether there ought to be some amendments to the design to cater for it. And one of the things that we've called on is that the government themselves, the federal government, should ask Treasury to assess the impact not only across Australia on a one-size-fits-all basis, but on a region-by-region basis. It can be done and it should be done.
To some extent your report does address those issues. Does it take it any further than what you've just talked about in terms of addressing the specific impact in regional areas?
Well, I mean, the report identifies the problem, and I guess the government has to find a way. And what we're talking about here, in particular, is a short and medium-term transition. What we believe is that the government hasn't sufficiently catered for the short, medium-term transitional requirements. They're flying blind as far as the impact on jobs are concerned, and the impact from a short to medium-term transition in terms of jobs, and they're flying blind as far as the impact on regional Australia is concerned. These are two areas where the government should do more work and where the government should have a very close look as to how the design of the carbon pollution reduction scheme ought to be changed.
We spoke recently to Peter Anderson, the head of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and while he certainly would like to see some changes to the emissions trading scheme, he seemed particularly concerned about the need to hold off until business was able to deal with its introduction when the economy was actually stronger and in recovery.
Look, I mean, talking from a coalition point of view, the coalition has said all along that we should not be implementing this before July 2011, perhaps even July 2012. And so the government has been attacking us for that, calling us names, etc. And we note that they now have come on board with what we've been saying all along. However, that is only one step. The most important thing is to get the scheme right and to make sure that it's a scheme that is both environmentally effective and economically responsible. And that is where we still have got a way to go. Because at present, it is a scheme that will hurt our exporting industries without actually achieving an environmental benefit. And that is the main problem we've got with it. And Australians who are asked to make a sacrifice have not so far been told what difference is going to be achieved by them making that sacrifice. And we believe that Australians deserve to know that if they're being asked to make a sacrifice, what is the government actually trying to achieve? And it's time that the government actually told us this is what we aim to achieve in terms of a reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions.
The impact on consumers, what did the report find in terms of the effect that an emissions trading scheme, such things as the price of electricity, the price of gas, etc., and so forth? The impact on consumers, obviously there will be an impact on consumers. What did the report find in terms of the effect that it would have on the price of such things as electricity and gas?
Well, we've had evidence, and I mean this is not that clear because again, I mean we consider the Treasury modelling was quite deficient and underestimated the economic impact, including the impact in terms of costs for consumers because of the flawed assumptions in the modelling. However, we've had some evidence that electricity prices will go up by at least 25% directly as a result of the carbon pollution reduction scheme, possibly even by up to 100%. We've had evidence that the price of fuel obviously is going to go up. Look, it's going to go out. It's going to go through the whole economy. If the price of power goes up, then the price of consumer goods produced with power is going to go up, and it's to be an impact all throughout the community. Now, I mean, there's always going to be some cost, and we acknowledge that. But the question again is, what benefit for the cost we pay? And that is a question that the government to date hasn't answered.
As far as other energy sources are concerned, renewables, alternative fuels, I think there's a general acceptance that we do eventually need to move to these, but the question is how quickly can that be done?
And that's the point. I mean, clearly everybody agrees we should rely more and more on renewable energy, but there are some lead times. There's still some question marks as to how reliable from a base load power point of view some of these renewable technologies are. Well, in fact, at this stage, there is no renewable energy as such that is able to provide a sustained supply of base load power. So, I mean, I'm sure it'll happen, but it's not something that's around the corner over the next 2 or 3 years. Again, to the transitional arrangements, where we don't believe that the government has put enough emphasis on how we are actually going to take Australia through the transition without hurting people unnecessarily, and keeping in mind always the overarching objective that we're trying to achieve, rather than to get caught up in a bureaucratic system or bureaucratic processes.
Just going back to the issue of employment, the impact on jobs, obviously there will be an impact on employment as a result of an emissions trading scheme, but the point's also made that new jobs will be created. For instance, in the green sector, green jobs. That is a positive, isn't it?
I mean, there'll be some green jobs, but there's nobody that seriously suggests that there will be enough green jobs, for example, to offset 20,000 people losing their job in Wollongong. I mean, if you look at the impact across a broad section of industries, steel, aluminium, cement, coal, industries that are sort of significant industries across Australia, there's absolutely no way that green jobs, as the government would suggest, will be able to compensate for all of the job losses that are coming our way. But critically, I mean, the government doesn't even know, because the government, rather than to assess the impact on jobs, made a decision to assume that there will be full employment all throughout the implementation of the scheme.
Well, indeed, concerns were raised by both the CFMEU and the AWU. At the same time, you said there was a degree of bipartisanship on the committee, even though you issued differing reports. In all honesty, do you think there really is common ground that can be reached between the government and the opposition on this?
Well, I mean, the government has to come down from its sort of high horse, and I guess to some extent they've sort of put their toe in the water a couple of times. Like this time last year, you know, we were being accused of being climate deniers and skeptics. You know, early this year, the Treasurer, you know, after we'd gone through the Garner Review, the Green Paper, the White Paper, 5 minutes to midnight, Wayne Swan announces a new inquiry into the choice of an emissions trading scheme. That inquiry was then canned a week later because it became too hot to handle for the government. But then we've seen earlier this week the new announcement by the Prime Minister announcing the delay and various other bits and pieces. That was unthinkable only even 2 or 3 weeks ago. I mean, I think you'll find that the government is desperately looking now for political strategy on how they can get themselves out of the mess that they got themselves into, but it's sort of a matter of I guess they will want to come up with a better way forward without making us look good and sort of essentially keeping as much face as possible, I guess, from their point of view. That's the process that we're going through. I guess what we are calling on the government to do as a committee for fuel and energy is just have a serious look at this. We all agree that we should reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, come up with a better way. We hope that both the government and the opposition are going to very closely look at the issues that we have identified in our report, and you know, hopefully down the track there will be a more united approach to this, where the politics perhaps are put to one side.
In their dissenting report, the government senators said that if we don't act now, it's really a recipe for never acting on climate change. And they also said that business deserves some certainty in all this. There is a point to that, isn't there?
2 weeks ago, the government was telling us that we were reckless and irresponsible for not agreeing to implement the scheme on 1 July 2010. 2 weeks later, the government tells us, oh well, we're going to delay to 1 July 2011. Essentially, I mean, we take some of these criticisms with the ground. It's part of the political process. We think that we have identified a series of serious concerns and flaws in the carbon pollution reduction scheme as is currently proposed. We think it's incumbent on the government to very seriously consider the issues that we've raised and just stop the political rhetoric and get on with the job of actually improving the public policy framework.
Well, I mean, on political rhetoric, just again to quote from the dissenting report, the Labor senators say that the majority report, your report, simply...
You seem to be very interested in the minority report.
Well, I mean, I think they're the alternative views, and in a sense I'm just putting them to you.
They're the government's views, yeah.
Yeah, they're the government's views. Just putting them to you, that it presents a partisan and unrepresentative assessment of the views of the community. You obviously disagree with that. It's a very substantial report. You've talked to a lot of people.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I think it's much easier. Like, I mean, the Senate is a pretty robust, a very robust institution, scrutinising the activity of government very effectively. And whoever is in opposition is going to be better at scrutinising government than whoever is on the government benches. So, I mean, I consider that our committee has taken its job very seriously. We haven't pursued this from a partisan point of view. I understand why government senators would be saying that, but I mean, I think it's just that it's part of the political dialogue.
Finally, as we mentioned, this report is an interim report on emissions trading. Your inquiry is looking at the much broader issue of fuel and energy. When can we expect that final report? And in terms of fuel and energy, what are the sorts of other issues that you're looking at?
Essentially, our broader focus is, of course, energy security for Australia moving forward, and how we can ensure that there's an affordable, sustainable supply of energy in an environmental way. So we have got a whole range of other issues that we're looking at. Renewables is something that we will have a specific focus on, looking at the state and federal regulatory environment for the fuel and energy sector to sort of see how it impacts the supply of energy into the future. We also will have a focus on petrol and petrol pricing itself. So there's still a lot of work to be done. We are due to report by October this year, but of course this emissions trading scheme issue has taken a lot of our time in the first 12 months that we've been acting and working as a committee.
Senator Cormann, thank you very much again for your time today. Thanks for talking to us on Viewpoint.
Thank you very much.